when Mr. Assange was apprehended in the Ecuadorian embassy in London, he was still Ecuadorian. Yeah. He was naturalized Ecuadorian, and as far as we know, the Ecuadorian state still hasn't concluded the process of stripping him from his nationality. So this is really serious. It is in breach actually of certain things of international law, but it's really in breach of the Ecuadorian laws and constitution. Moreno's been governing from above with sort of an elite pact to try, so this includes the media, some business sectors, some what used to be sort of right-wing opposition parties to us, to try and eradicate us. And so, there's a real effort to, I would say, sort of expel, banish the citizens' revolution, Correism in general, even from people's memories, So there's complete ban on interviews. The interviews I'm giving with you guys would be impossible in Ecuador. The only way I can give an interview in Ecuador is in alternative media. It's unbelievable. It's real criminalization of activism in a way that we've never seen before.
I'll never apologize for the United States of America. Ever. I don't care what the facts are.
Why are we going to sit down and talk to these quote-unquote moderate rebels?
Who are the truly moderate rebels?
The search for the moderate rebel. Do these moderate rebels exist?
Moderate
rebels.
You are listening to Moderate Rebels. I'm Ben Norton, joined by my co-host Max Blumenthal, and today we're talking about something that should scare journalists throughout the entire world. It's a terrifying development, the arrest of Julian Assange. This is the publisher of WikiLeaks, a renowned journalist who was essentially held captive as a political prisoner in the Ecuadorian embassy in London, and now the British government has arrested him, and he has been charged by the US government and is likely going to be extradited. Well, today we're going to talk with the former Foreign Minister of Ecuador, Guillaume Long.
Oh, thank you for having me on your show.
So thanks so much for joining us, Guillaume. We're going to talk about this issue that, while much of the corporate media is treating it as something, kind of normal, even positive, it actually terrifies journalists like Max and me and many others because of the press implications. And I'm wondering if you could talk about your response. You served as foreign minister under the former leftist president in Ecuador, Rafael Correa, and he was a strong supporter of Julian Assange and was the one who actually provided support to him in the Ecuadorian embassy in London. Now, the current president, Lenin Moreno, who has taken a neoliberal turn and is working with Washington, he's the one who turned Assange over in what Correa described as one of the greatest acts of betrayal in the history of not just Ecuador, but all of Latin America. And that's also extremely interesting because I believe it was Lenin Moreno's government that actually gave Ecuadorian citizenship to Assange, so that compounds the scandal further. Can you respond?
Yeah, sure. I think we're dealing with two different types of breach of international and actually national law as well, Ecuador's national laws. So the first you mentioned correctly is the political asylum, or diplomatic asylum, is the same institution fundamentally, that was granted to Julian Assange in August 2012. Julian Assange showed up at the Ecuadorian embassy in June 2012, explained what he was worried about, and based on international law, based on Ecuador's membership of a number of instruments that regulate the institution of political asylum, Ecuador 2 months later took the decision to grant Julian Assange political asylum. And this decision was based on most international instruments who deal with asylum mentioned the kind of legitimate fear of a state that a citizen of another state could be politically persecuted or could have his life threatened or his safety and personal security jeopardized or his human rights threatened, etc., etc. So it was based on that. And the fundamental element that sort of justified the asylum was the fear of extradition to the United States, right? So I think that's really important because we've come, full circle here. In August 2012, it was the fear of extradition that warranted Ecuador's granting of the asylum. This lasted for many years. We can go into that maybe in more depth and what happened during these years. Ecuador always insisting that they didn't have when there were other issues at hand, when there were sexual allegations in Sweden. Ecuador always insisted, no problem. Ecuador does not want to stand in the way of Swedish justice. Mr. Assange can go to Sweden, providing there is no extradition to a third country from Sweden. And Sweden then refused to give those guarantees. And then a similar situation when there was no more case in Sweden, when it was just a jumping of bail in United Kingdom, Ecuador saying to the United Kingdom, no problem, if he's jumped bail and there's a fine to pay, or if he has to spend a few days in jail, it's rarely more than 3 months when you jump bail in the British courts, and no problem. Mr. Assange has been in there for years. I'm sure 3 months is not an issue. Mr. Assange's lawyers agreed with that. Mr. Assange agreed with that. But again, the same problem was, but if we are to hand over Mr. Assange to British justice for jumping bail, then we need a guarantee of non-extradition. And again, the British authorities refused to give that guarantee. So the central issue of extradition is really important in the case of the political asylum of Mr. Assange, because it is what sort of justified the state's decision that there was a potential political persecution here, which is what is behind the institution of political asylum. So that's the asylum issue. But asylum is for foreigners, for people for aliens, right? Now, on top of that, as you rightly said, this government, the Lenin Moreno government, under his first foreign minister, Maria Fernandez Espinosa, granted him nationality. And as far as we know, in fact, we know because the government is saying now that it's currently in the process of, I don't know what the exact technical American word is for that, but taking away Assange's nationality, right? So stripping him of his nationality. This means that when Mr. Assange was apprehended in the Ecuadorian embassy in London, he was still Ecuadorian. Yeah? He was naturalized Ecuadorian, and as far as we know, the Ecuadorian state still hasn't concluded the process of stripping him from his nationality. So this is really serious. It is in breach actually of certain things of international law, but it's really in breach of the Ecuadorian laws and constitution. In the Ecuadorian constitution, you cannot extradite a national to another country. Yeah, you cannot hand over a national to the judiciary of another country. So, both for the political asylum case and the naturalization and stripping of nationality case, but stripping of nationality itself is also a legal issue. You can't strip someone of their nationality. In Ecuador, there are all sorts of legal problems with that. But on both these issues, there are legal problems, and there will be legal repercussions for the Moreno administration.
Moreno is explicitly violating the Ecuadorian constitution in stripping Assange of his citizenship.
Absolutely. There's no doubt about that. It's not the first time Moreno does that to the Ecuadorian constitution. He's been ruling like that for 2 years with all sorts of unconstitutional means and practices. It's a pretty, there's a sort of encroaching authoritarianism in Ecuador that's getting scarier and scarier. But this is a very good case of him doing that. And you now have Ecuadorian institutions, the few that are left that are semi-independent, that are already threatening to take action. We'll see in the coming days a number of actions within the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, which is a court that is based in Costa Rica. Ecuador is a member, and the Inter-American Human Rights Court was very clear. In fact, from last year through 2018, when the first rumors emerged that Mr. Moreno was thinking of handing over Assange, because these rumors have now been going on for a while, the Inter-American Human Rights Court was very clear that Ecuador could not do that, that it would be in breach of international law. And the Moreno administration went ahead with it anyway. But I think we're going to see juridical, legal repercussions, both on the asylum case, which was granted in 2012, and on the handing over of a Ecuadorian national case. These are the two fundamental legal cases we're facing now.
Would those have any effect on the UK's decision to extradite Assange? We heard Theresa May declare that Assange, no one in the UK is above the law, but it appears that the UK is intent on behaving as if it's above international law in honoring American power and its desire and obsession to essentially have Assange brought home and possibly prosecuted under the Espionage Act.
Yeah, I can't see how sort of Ecuador's breach of domestic and international law would affect the UK's decision. I think the case of the UK extraditing or not extraditing Julian Assange, and of course I hope he's not extradited, as you rightly said, I think we should, this has been, the whole thing has been how to shift the narrative from him being a whistleblower and a journalist and a publisher. And in the United States, there's now, well, since 1989, the Whistleblower Protection Act, right? To moving it to the field of espionage, as you rightly said.
And Lenin Moreno called him a hacker. I think that those words were put in his mouth, it sounded like.
It's amazing because the whole, and he said this before making him an Ecuadorian national, right? So there are all sorts of issues with regards to Ecuador that are difficult to comprehend. And I think, the word incompetence is important. People, there are bad intentions and there are evil doings, but there's also sheer sort of incompetence, right? And lots of variables at hand here, and a divided cabinet. Now it's much less divided because he's purged the left from his government, but at the time he still had some actors kind of from the so-called political left involved in his cabinet in the early years when he was doing the transition from Correa and pretending that there was some kind of continuation, right? So there are all sorts of issues there. But I think the British authorities are going to be under increasing pressure, and you're going to see pressure from all corners, including some of the pressures that the Ecuadorian state was facing. So I'm thinking of international institutions, the multilateral institutions, the UN. So just a few days before Moreno handed over Assange, the special rapporteur on torture kind of, openly sort of warned Ecuador not to hand over Assange to the UK because he ran the risk of being extradited to the United States and therefore face conditions that would be similar to Chelsea Manning, which amounted, according to the special rapporteur on torture, to torture, essentially.
Right.
You also had you have the kind of work that's been done by the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention since its opinion 54 in January 2015, calling this an arbitrary detention. We've got also the Inter-American Human Rights Court now, which is involved in this, and this is more kind of on the legal sort of multilateral international law side of things, which has and sometimes relative weight. Let's put it. Unfortunately, international law is not always respected by the powerful actors. But you've also got the human rights community. You're going to have a lot of actors, including surprisingly some mainstream actors who are thinking, "Oh, we don't like Assange. We never really liked him." But Assange being, Assange holed up, as the media called it, I think rather unfairly, in the Ecuadorian embassy in the UK is not the same as Assange in a British high security prison about to face extradition to the United States, right? You're going to get all sorts of people in the center that are already sort of expressing their fears, the repercussions this can have on the journalistic profession, the whole issue of freedom of expression. So what I'm trying to say is I think there's going to be mounting pressure, political pressure, on Theresa May's government. And of course, we should all mount that pressure as much as we can. But I think it's not as simple as that for Theresa May. a weak government facing Brexit and all sorts of other variables to extradite Assange to the United States.
Yeah, and you mentioned that Assange is now in a British prison. He's actually in Belmarsh prison outside of London, which is referred to affectionately as Britain's Guantanamo Bay, where they hold so-called terrorists, which sends a message to other whistleblowers and dissident journalists and publishers. But I also want to talk a bit about the domestic situation in Ecuador, because clearly this is not just an international campaign. I mean, it is to an extent, of course. The U.S. government has been pressuring Ecuador for many years, but the previous president, Correa, who wanted independent foreign policy, who was, a staunch leftist and believed in sovereignty and independence for his country, refused to, acquiesce. But we've seen Lenin Moreno, he not only has acquiesced, but it seems that he is doing this to kind of garner favor with the U.S. and international institutions. I'm, of course, referring to a multi-billion-dollar IMF loan that Lenin Moreno recently agreed to with the International Monetary Fund, a notorious vehicle of soft power for the U.S., which also ironically has a very long history of trapping Latin American countries in kind of neo-colonial debt bondage. And then, of course, there is a domestic corruption scandal involving the president. So maybe can you talk about why Lenin Moreno would so blatantly violate, as you mentioned, not only his own country's laws, but international law?
Yeah, I think the two factors you've just mentioned are correct. Since Lenin Moreno came to power, there's been a major realignment of foreign policy and sort of geopolitical doctrine and security doctrine, whatever. So we've seen a move back into the US fold and a alignment with the Trump administration. There have been a few key visits. So Paul Manafort back in 2017, just after Moreno was elected, and then more recently Vice President Pence going to Ecuador, and we know there were a number of deals that were made there. So you're seeing a change, sort of geopolitical change of Ecuador and an alignment with the United States, sort of a subordination to what is now the US's explicit Monroe Doctrine. And so you're seeing this with a U-turn on Venezuela. You're seeing it in security policies. So the US military is back in Ecuador, after Ecuador having the largest military base in Latin America and President Correa saying thank you, but no thank you, and closing down the military base. I think it was a big priority for the United States to, even if it's symbolically, to have a return of some kind of US military presence. So it's not a big base anymore, but there are overflights. As far as I understand, they're pretty constant overflights on behalf of the US military over Ecuador. And also in policing, the FBI are back, and they're sort of playing a close role in the police force and so on and so forth. Security
Cooperation Office.
Yeah, they signed a deal for a cooperation office, and they're also, I think, we'd stopped military and police training in the US as well, and I think that's back on the cards. So you're going to see the Ecuadorian military going back to the US and police, all these deals that have come to an end are basically back on the cards. Some of it is open, some of it is not so open, so we'd have to have a look exactly what the nature of the deals are, but I think a large chunk of Mike Pence's visit to Ecuador had to do with this. Then you've also got a realignment on the whole, I don't know if you know this case, but the whole Chevron Texaco case, which has to do with a historic sort of pollution of the Amazon region in Ecuador and the demand of judicial process that was started by the communities that were affected by that oil spill, the indigenous communities,
right,
and the role that Ecuador played there under Correa to support the communities and to try and fight jurisdiction hopping, which was what the game that Chevron Texaco was playing in order to. This was always a big thing for the U.S. We felt it when we were in government in a relationship with the United States. Chevron, the protection of Chevron Texaco's interest was always a big prerogative for the U.S. For U.S.'s relationship with Ecuador, so that's changed. And of course, you just mentioned it, the IMF loan. It was the New York Times that actually revealed, the first one to talk of a conditioning of the U.S. on the board of the IMF. As you know, the U.S. has a veto in the fund, So if the US doesn't say yes to the loan, there's no loan, right? And there was apparently a US, according to the New York Times, there's more and more evidence coming out on this, a US conditioning of Ecuador that they would approve the loan if Assange was handed over. So I think Assange is part of that geopolitical package. So a big right-wing turn in Ecuador, in Latin America, back into the US fold. But then there's also a more personal element, which I find even more sort of scary, which is the fact that President Moreno is facing a big corruption scandal, which has emerged over the last few months. It's called the INA Papers because there's this company, an offshore company called INA Investments. They found 2 bank accounts in Belize and in Panama, and it's President Moreno's brother. And with those accounts, they've been buying goods for President Moreno and his family, including a flat in the south of Spain. It's quite a big scandal. There's more and more evidence emerging. And then in the last few weeks, there were some major leaks of emails, chats, conversations, big leakage of information linked to the corruption scandal. And it's now called the scandal of INA Papers. And there were some tweets. Well, there was one tweet by WikiLeaks, actually, sort of attacking Moreno, saying, look, all this information has come out. It wasn't even information published on the WikiLeaks portal, but there was a tweet sort of, making noise and sort of spreading the news. WikiLeaks has a lot of followers, so the Twitter account has a lot of followers spreading the news. And Moreno's reaction was, was like, I think this is fundamentally a vindictive act of vengeance. And his expelling of Assange, aside from those kind of more geostrategic, geopolitical interests we just mentioned, is just sheer sort of personal vindictiveness, and that's that's really scary.
That was sort of when the escalation began at the embassy, and Moreno's administrators and staff began accusing Assange of smearing feces on the wall and being rude and not petting his cat enough and skateboarding through the hallways. And I mean that's kind of when they started to kind of turn up the heat and create all this litany of excuses for expelling him. Is that right? After WikiLeaks publicized the INA scandal, which has been sort of curiously and even studiously ignored in Western media and by corporate-funded anti-corruption groups like Transparency International.
Some of the egregious media reporting on this really misrepresented it. The New York Times actually referred to Assange's effective political imprisonment in the embassy as, quote, self-imposed isolation. They called it 7 years of self-imposed isolation, which is a blatant lie.
Yeah, he just doesn't like people. He's not a people person,
And of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that a UN working group that deals with arbitrary detention determined that Assange was being arbitrarily detained under international law. A UN working group said in a legally binding decision that Assange was being arbitrarily detained and that he not only was due to be released, but also compensated for his effective imprisonment.
Yeah, that's right. Opinion 54 of January 2015 of the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention established this as an arbitrary detention. And essentially as a miscarriage of justice, the whole situation, right? It's a very interesting document, which was fascinating at the time because Britain and Sweden have used the findings of the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention on numerous occasions to hit on governments that they haven't liked. And they've often been sort of the standard bearer of the findings of the Working Group. And when the Working Group came out with, accusing, because it was basically accusing Britain and Sweden of being the authors of this arbitrary detention and of this miscarriage of justice, they completely smeared the Working Group. It's really this case is so revealing of so many sort of double standards and the whole power the power symmetries of the international system we live in. But on your point regarding what I would say kind of it was a very slow and calculated erosion of the public image of Assange. Yeah, and I think this was a major strategy. It goes back to 2010. They detected, the people who were interested in eroding his public image or making him look bad, detected, you can, if you spend enough time on this, you can pretty much do this to anyone. They really sort of found ways of trying to portray him as a strange person. And they use all sorts of verbs. We just mentioned one, hold up in the embassy. You see this constantly in the sort of headlines of the press. I used another one, which was I can't remember, self-inflicted or...
Self-imposed isolation.
Yeah, self-imposed
But then
isolation.
also, for the past 2 years, numerous U.S. government officials, including leaders of the Democratic Party, and of course corporate media outlets, you mentioned the New York Times, has been leading the charge, smearing Assange as a Russian asset or even a Russian agent.
Yeah, so it's firing in all directions. The whole thing of how he was living in the embassy, it started actually before. There were a few leaks from various people who had either journalists or people who were working in security that had leaked information on how the whole situation was playing out in the embassy. And it was fairly easy to do. I mean, generally speaking, I was in charge of the embassy for a while, and even before that, I was sort of a go-between. I went to the embassy on numerous occasions. Generally speaking, the living conditions were extremely difficult, and given these extremely difficult living conditions, the relationship was pretty good. I saw Assange being, even bonding with certain Ecuadorian diplomats, and the Ecuadorian diplomats genuinely feeling sorry for him, But they were going home at night. I mean, even for Ecuadorian diplomats, this was a tough situation. You would struggle to make a phone call from the Ecuadorian embassy, right? Everything was, completely hacked from outside. It was the most spied on sort of per square meter, per capita place in the world. It was just really an embassy under siege. First, literally, with 65 police officers standing outside the front door, and then, through cameras, when the British police decided to lower the intensity of police presence, largely because there had been public outcry and the cost of these policemen outside the front door, and so they kind of kept it with cameras, and it was more sort of electronic, and it was clear that within the place was under siege. So it was difficult for everybody. It was difficult for Ecuadorian diplomats. But as I said, they were going home at night, whereas Assange was there in a very small space with no light, no natural light, no outside patio, with his health steadily declining. There's been mention of his eyesight. He had an arm that started getting paralyzed. Despite the fact he was doing exercise. I went through that process. I saw the steady deterioration over the years, and given the circumstances, I think it's the reverse could be the narrative. How he managed to remain sane and stuff. Not right. Whether there's some hacked footage of him on a skateboard in the corridor once in 7 years. This makes the whole. It's about trying to destroy the character. Make him as a difficult person. I remember there was a whole effort at the time as well to try and portray him as a sort of narcissist, and as there were different phases in trying to break him down. And I think a lot of this was done by the media as well.
Particularly by the media. And, there was one figure, James Ball, who was granted a column at The Guardian, I think, explicitly for this, or specifically for this purpose, because he was a former WikiLeaks employee, and he constantly harped on the personal affectations of Julian Assange and how eccentric he was, and called him an asshole. And even after he was arrested, his kind of his framing was Julian Assange is a humongous asshole, but we should stand up for press freedom. And, The Guardian it's been the center left in the US and the UK that has really carried this attempt to pathologize Julian Assange, when on a personal level, I can really relate to him in a way. And I think Ben can too. We haven't been subjected to the same kind of international scrutiny, but anyone right now who's sort of doing anti-imperialist journalism, who's hitting the same targets that WikiLeaks might have hit, you're going to be demonized in a way that you haven't before. And I feel like there's this attempt to controversialize us or someone like Glenn Greenwald, and on that level, I can personally relate to what Julian Assange is going through, being confined in a room for 7 years, or a few rooms for 7 years. I can't relate to that. Prisoners who've been in solitary confinement certainly could, and obviously the UN rapporteur had some really strong words about that. But I think what the point ultimately of pathologizing him is to erase the context behind his prosecution, whether it's the simple elemental point that Julian Assange is being hounded and persecuted and indicted because he embarrassed the empire, or the fact that there's this whole backstory that you've been describing in Ecuador, that Lenin Moreno is able to, or wants to sacrifice Julian Assange to cover up the fact that he is sacrificing his country's own independence. And that goes down to something we haven't talked about yet, which is a sort of a voter fraud scandal. I wonder if you could talk about the National Assembly not only finding this March that Moreno should be investigated for his offshore dealings in Panama through the INA scandal, but also the Council of Citizens' Participation in Social Control elections that were riddled with irregularities and allegations of fraud, and even the participation of the U.S. ambassador who was spotted visiting the headquarters of the National Electoral Council. I mean, what's going on here? It seems like something that Moreno would want to deflect from by handing the U.S. off this gigantic favor.
Yeah, I think, generally speaking, there's been a huge persecution of the only opposition that Moreno's had, which is the left, and the left that is coalesced around what we might call the Citizens' Revolution, which was, as you know, the name that was given to the 10 years of Rafael Correa's government. So Correísmo, or Citizens' Revolution, the left, broadly speaking, is still the biggest opposition to Moreno, who, after winning the election as Correa's successor, sort of did a 180-degree U-turn, actually said publicly that he liked the people who didn't vote for him. He said it on, in a meeting on record, which poses a lot of problems in terms of democratic accountability and what are elections for, and the importance of truth and campaigning. And
didn't Correa did call him a Trojan horse, didn't he?
Yeah, it's Trojan horse. Lots of us are doing lots of work at the moment to try and writing and thinking, try and understand where all this comes from. I think there are all sorts of reasons and psychological reasons, and there are all sorts of factors. And he was probably leaned on heavily a while ago before we realized that this was happening. But anyway, so there was this U-turn, and then what Moreno decided to do, realizing that the only thing, Moreno's been governing from above with sort of an elite pact to try, so this includes the media, some business sectors, some what used to be sort of right-wing opposition parties to us, to try and eradicate us. And so, there's a real effort to, I would say, sort of expel, banish the Citizens' Revolution, Correísmo in general, from people's memories, So there's complete ban on interviews. The interviews I'm giving with you guys would be impossible in Ecuador. The only way I can give an interview in Ecuador is in alternative media, online, sort of different social networks that have media and so on. But I would never be able to give an interview on national television or in the mainstream press or something. It's amazing. not out of vanity. You know, I was Foreign Minister of Ecuador, and I've not given an interview in 2 years. And I can assure you that during our government, all the former foreign ministers of Ecuador were always on the press, sort of laying on thick about how they disliked us. You know, so there's a real. What I'm trying to say here is there's the real sort of. It's a closed network and it's a closed alliance. The media has erased our voice. There's an attempt to change the history. There's an attempt to change the narrative and to eradicate from people's memory this 10 years of Correa's government. This is failing. It's not working. We just saw that from an iPhone in Belgium, Correa managed to sort of do lead a successful electoral campaign and get lots of people elected in the last regional and local elections, which were held in March, despite the fact that they banned us. This is thing, you know, I could go on like this, but the fact that they banned us from having a party, we managed at the last minute to sort of borrow a party and to run with a borrowed party, which it's very hard to do because people don't know the party, they don't recognize the colors, they don't recognize, it's just all these things, like putting you you start the race a mile behind everybody else, right? And despite this, we won, the governorship of Pichincha, which is the governorship of the state where the capital is, the most populated states, and it's very important electoral victories from almost a clandestine electoral campaign, essentially on social networks. So that goes to show that their effort has failed, despite what you mentioned. Some pretty strong irregularities in the electoral council, but starting from an irregularity even before they started counting the votes, which is banning us from running, right? That's the first irregularity. And then, the involvement of the U.S. Embassy in all sorts of aspects. I mean, I think the role of the U.S. Embassy and the declarations that the U.S. ambassador makes just are so partisan in favor of Moreno and against us that it's just unbelievable. It's so clear what this is all about.
And can you explain more the situation politically with the party? Because you mentioned that Correa left the Alianza País party, which was the party that he had created and been the leader of and ruled as president. This was it's not even in the U.S. This country is so far right politically that everything to the left of the Democratic Party is portrayed as radical and socialist. But Correa's party, the Alianza País, the País Alliance Party, was never that left-wing. It was, social democratic and independent in foreign policy orientation. But even that was too much, and I know that he created a new party, so maybe can you explain the situation? And then also, can you explain the situation with Correa himself, who is in Belgium right now, and you heavily criticized the government after an Ecuadorian judge tried to charge Correa with a kidnapping of an opposition politician, and you have heavily criticized that. Can you respond?
Yeah, on the first point, Alianza País is a young party, or was a young party, because I don't think it really exists anymore, created by Correa in 2006 in order to be able to run. The historic left-wing parties in Ecuador were very weak at the time. They were very delegitimized. They had collaborated with another traitor, Lucio Gutierrez, who had run on a left-wing platform and then betrayed his left-wing platform. So Correa considered it necessary to create a new party. And the new party was the most successful party in the history of Ecuador by far. So, it got to the point where you had 2/3 majority in parliament, when you hadn't had a majority in parliament, even a normal majority in parliament, since the late 1980s, early 1990s, and this was Alianza País was a very successful party, and as you said, it was a very heterogeneous party. So you had some of the hard left in that party, But you also had a very sort of more social democratic and less sort of ideological, rigorous people who were inside the party. It was a mass party, a bit like the PT has been in Brazil, where it's very heterogeneous. In the PT, you find some radicals, but you also find a lot of moderates, including some sort of neoliberal moderates, unfortunately. And I think the same was true of Aliança País. But it's amazing because it's not some historic party and then Correa became the leader of the party. It was a party very much associated with Correa because he created it. So I think in a way it's even more symbolic that Moreno managed to take away the party from his creator, right? And he did it through a judicial ruling, So by his gradual control of the judiciary, Moreno managed to get a judicial ruling whereby they took the party away from Correa, right? So it's an unbelievable story. And this enabled, and the party doesn't exist anymore because obviously Moreno was nobody in the party, Correa was everything. It's a bit like, I don't know, if the PT had been taken away from Lula, or if the PSUV had been taken away by Chavez, and some sort of random, much less important person had taken the helm and tried to sell the story to the militants and the members of the party that the other guy was the bad guy. Nobody really swallowed that story. So gradually the party became an empty shell, which is what it is now. And in the last elections, it's on the verge of disappearing because it doesn't have the right, it's on the verge of not having sufficient amount of votes to survive within Ecuadorian law. So it's unbelievable. Moreno took the party to destroy it because all the party members fled it and were for a while in a limbo because there wasn't anything to replace it. And now that we've managed to create some precarious political structure, despite all the persecution, have joined that precarious political structure and made it significantly stronger and so on and so forth. That's on your first question. On your second question regarding Correa's sort of exile, I suppose, in Belgium, it is and it isn't an exile because Correa had always said that once he would leave office, he would go to Belgium. He said this 2-3 years before leaving office. He was still president. His wife is Belgian. He's lived in Belgium before. And he wanted, this was the deal that he made with his family. His kids were studying in Europe. He wanted to be in Belgium for a few years. So as soon as he handed over the presidential sash to his successor, to Lenin Moreno, he left for Belgium. But then he came back at a crucial time, at an electoral moment, and he proved when he was there for a month in Ecuador, he was the head of the opposition, and he had the power to coalesce. And so for the Moreno administration, the only thing that they could do, what they really wanted is for him not to visit Ecuador. And so you start seeing, from about a year ago, court cases. First ridiculous things. They couldn't really nail anything. They didn't find any corruption. They couldn't find anything. So they started with things as stupid as a level of indebtedness of the Ecuadorian state, which actually is not a crime in itself because it's part of public office. Yeah. And it's even more funny than that because Ecuador is one of the least indebted countries in Latin America, right? So Correa left.
Well, and it's also the cherry on top is that Correa was trying to move away from these neoliberal U.S.-dominated financial institutions like the IMF and World Bank, and now Lenin Moreno is taking a multi-billion-dollar loan from the IMF, which is going to trap Ecuador in precisely that kind of debt trap.
Well, he's going to double Correa's debt.
And you had, I think, 10,000 layoffs recently, public layoffs.
I think it'll go up to 100,000. Yeah.
Jesus.
So, and out of 550,000 workers, state workers, that's a big.
That's shocking. And then, that's the agenda, I guess.
Yeah, that's the agenda. It's the whole thing is filled with post-truths, with fake news, with this kind of post-truth reality that unfortunately so much of the world's politics is engulfed in. And you saw first it was the indebtedness, and then they thought, oh no, that's not a criminal charge. So, and anyway, he was 28% of GDP, and European average is 100% of GDP. That doesn't look very serious. So they dropped that, and so they've been trying different things. And as you rightly said, one of the things they tried is this kidnapping charge, which is also ludicrous, of someone who was a well-known criminal in Ecuador who was hiding out in Colombia, and there was a failed kidnapping attempt. We don't really know what happened, but it was probably some people that he had business dealings with, including some members of the police, of the Ecuadorian police, some kind of rookie sectors of the Ecuadorian police. And so through these elements of the Ecuadorian police, by offering them less of a sentence, they tried to make them accuse Correa, and you get the picture, and try as if it was ordered by Correa. So, I mean, and it goes on and on and now, and he's got, I mean, there's only one arrest warrant in Ecuador against Correa based on this case, which the Interpol has discarded. So, I mean, that's a big blow to the case because the Interpol said it's political persecution. So the only place where the arrest warrant is valid is Ecuador. Everywhere else it's void and null. So that's good for us, and it shows how little credibility it has. But there are another 25 criminal cases that have been initiated in Ecuador against Correa. 25. So it really shows you the sort of desperation behind trying to ostracize him from Ecuadorian politics.
It's like a legal coup.
Yeah, I think that's a good definition. Yeah. The legal coup, I mean, there was a referendum last year. Today they would have won it, but it was right when Moreno was on the up. Now he's on like 16% credibility, so he would have lost it. But when Moreno was elected, soon after, he played an intelligent, although very evil card, but he played an intelligent card because Correa had polarized a lot for a few years. So Moreno played now it's time for dialogue, and it worked for a while, and it enabled him to pass a referendum to ban Correa from re-election, number one, and he succeeded to do that. Now it wouldn't pass. Number two, to reorganize all the courts and the checks and balances of the country by organizing this temporary council that he himself named, so that they would rename all the authorities, attorney general, prosecutor, the courts, the ombudsman, the audit office, which is very important if you want to persecute your enemies, the administrative audit office. And that passed in a referendum. And then a third question, which is really interesting actually and shows the true colors. Under the Correa government, there was a law that was passed on land surplus value. So if I think that's what you call it in English, plusvalia in Spanish. So if there's extraordinary sort of what's it called, capital gain value on land. So if your house or if a bit of land goes from 10,000 a hectare to 10 million a hectare, then there's a windfall tax on undue surplus value, which Correa brought in, and it was a great thing against land speculation, and it was a great thing against, one of the key things that Marx identified in capitalism, which is, undue surplus value, right? And that really irked some business sectors in Ecuador, and a lot of the people who were like profiteering from speculation on land, and so through the referendum, the same referendum, there's several questions. Moreno sort of put a cross on that law and eliminated it and brought back the old system, which enables land speculators to make a lot of money again. So those were the three crucial questions that Moreno managed to get through during that short lapse of time when he was still popular, and that enabled for Correa not to run again, and B, to be able to run the judiciary and other sectors of the other institutions to be able to persecute Correa and his followers.
We always hear from the Republicans in the U.S. about the capital gains tax. They talk about it like, it's the bubonic plague, and so it's funny to hear about it in another context. advanced by someone who was once, the vice president of a progressive party, and just shows how much influence the U.S. can exert to advance the Republican agenda globally through a bipartisan consensus. We don't hear about any of this stuff in Western media. And one thing that has been reported, but I think should be more widely understood, especially by listeners of Moderate Rebels. You talked about the creeping authoritarianism in Ecuador. What's happening with this encryption expert, Olabini, who was arrested in Ecuador, who had been working there since 2013, who is from Sweden, is a Swedish national, and appears to have been arrested as part of the whole WikiLeaks dragnet. What's the situation there?
I think we're seeing again the same sort of vindictive attitude on behalf of the administration. They see Moreno's credibility collapse, as I've said, but they're also seeing, and obviously Moreno is seeing, that his political pact, especially after the elections that he had in March, is fast crumbling. He's losing his allies. And in the face of this huge corruption scandal that I mentioned earlier, his future is very uncertain. Basically, his future either lies in jail or in exile. And I'm saying this. I speak to a lot of lawyers, including not particularly progressive ones in Ecuador, and I try and speak to everybody, and everybody's pretty in agreement that the kind of the proofs, the evidence that's there is so incriminating that Moreno's future is pretty dark. So that explains part of, we've discussed this already with regards to Assange, but I think they identified someone who was close to Assange, whom they think is close to WikiLeaks, although he's not formally part of the organization. And it's true that for a while, I remember after the Assange thing, it brought attention to, Ecuador was suddenly on the map of a number of activists around the world in a number of areas. For example, in intellectual property, we were advocating in all sorts of ways, including in our university reform and intellectual property right reform, sort of public knowledge. We had a big debate on public goods and commons and so on. Ecuador in that sense was, I think, singular. Every lefty, pink-tide regime in Latin America had different characteristics. In some way, Ecuador was economically more cautious. In other ways, and in some ways that was a good thing as well. In other ways, it was more radical, and certainly it had sort of there was an academic character to it and an experimental character to it that it attracted first a lot of lefty academics who went to Ecuador, and secondly, because of the Assange thing, because of the intellectual property issue, because of the common knowledge issue, a lot of sort of techie people who were into sort of privacy and internet activists, the whole movement, cypherpunks, all this kind of stuff. And there was quite a big community of people who came to Ecuador and sort of used it as their base to do some activism on those issues. Privacy on internet, what's the big cryptography, I think, is one of the things that, And so I think Olabini, whom I've never met, but in fact, I only found out about his existence as you did, But I think from what I've read, came a few years ago to Ecuador as part of that wave. But he was someone that was close to Assange, knew him personally. And so, the government just went for him, locked him up without any accusation or any evidence. It was amazing. There was a tweet by the police force after sort of walking into his, they arrested him at the airport, and then they went into his flat, and they found, lots of techie stuff and hard drives and USBs and, the usual stuff that, these activists have. And it was like used. It was unbelievable. The tweet, eventually they deleted the tweet, but the tweet was saying, look at all this evidence of criminal activity. And there was a book on internet, and another one on hacking, and another one on this, and they just, it's unbelievable. It's real criminalization of activism in a way that we've never seen before.
I was just reading the wires on Olabini, and it's like he was caught with 3 hard drives. It's like, okay, well, I got 3 hard drives on my desk right now. What the hell does that prove? But it makes it seem like, oh, he's got some secrets there. I don't know.
Yeah, they lined it up on the police pictures as if they were like sort of kilograms of cocaine, you know. And they had it like as if, or guns or weapons or something, you know. They really lined it, and they make this whole narrative around this, and it's difficult to explain because it's so surreal. The post-truth sort of moment in Ecuadorian politics that we're living, that it's difficult to have a rational conversation about it because none of this is rational. It's all about perceptions. It's all about fast-moving images, especially now that they're trying to get away from the debate on Moreno's corruption. Their way of running away from that has been to bombard the public agenda with different kinds of issues and different kinds of threats, and it's very fast-turning. So it's based on like no memory of what happened the day before, no stress and no focus on the outcome of the court cases. It's a very, very sad reality.
I wonder which country they learned that from.
On the subject of political persecution, there's one other figure I think we need to talk about, and that's Jorge Glass, who's the former vice president. Maybe you can talk about his case. This is the second vice president under Correa. Lenin Moreno was the first vice president, and he was Correa replaced Moreno with Jorge Glass. And Glass was imprisoned for alleged corruption and actually was on hunger strike. He was hospitalized and then taken back to jail, where he's still in prison right now. So can you talk about the case with Jorge Glass?
Yeah, Jorge Glass was our first political prisoner. He was, as you rightly said, Correa's last vice president. And when Moreno came to power, he was elected on a ticket with Jorge Glass as his vice president. So the vice presidency continued in the hands of Jorge Glass, and he was elected by universal suffrage. And then in some incredible turnaround of situation, Moreno started persecuting him. The assembly, in an irregular way, took away his immunity and allowed for his persecution, all based on hearsay and sort of accusations that were part of the Odebrecht scandal, but there were never any proofs, there was never any money found, there was never any account, and nothing like what we found in the case of Moreno, with accounts, with dollar signs, with transfers. There was nothing. It was all about what the Santos from Odebrecht said in exchange for pretty much almost being forgiven for all of Odebrecht's corruption. And eventually Moreno managed to get him to jail. And I think it was really important for Moreno, as part of his nefarious political strategy, to do that. It was part of his plan, because having a diehard Correista defender of the citizens' revolution as his vice president meant that he felt that that it put him in a vulnerable situation, especially as this is really important to understand, that Moreno sees himself as a transitionary figure. Yeah? So I don't think he'll finish his term. I think that his credibility and his legitimacy is so low, and his polling numbers are so low, it's now below the 20% mark, that I think he'll struggle to he doesn't have a party of his own. So he's depending on all these people in parliament that respond to different sectors of the right wing to sort of support him, and they're starting to get cold feet because his corruption is starting to tarnish their reputation as well. So I think he's going to be abandoned by everybody, and he'll be the transition from the right wing's point of view to try and move to a right wing president, and probably the current mayor of Guayaquil, who's just sort of stepped down, and his right hand woman has been elected. He would be a potential candidate from the right to replace Moreno. But in order to do that transition, Moreno, if he does quit, and this is a hypothesis that I'm believing in more and more, he needs to hand in to a vice president. And so, which is why we've seen now 3 vice presidents, because he wasn't happy with the second one either. And so now there's a vice president who really responds to the interest of the right wing in Ecuador, who probably Moreno and his allies would be comfortable to do this transition with. So I think that's what it's all about. He needed to get rid of this kind of Correa loyalist who was his vice president and who's in prison and under the circumstances you've described. He's actually in a common prison, which also is extremely problematic for a politician whose life is at risk, and has been there for a while. For a year and a half now, I think it is, and with no evidence whatsoever used in his trial.
Yeah, and then finally, Guillaume, maybe we can step back a bit and look at the larger geopolitics. Earlier, you mentioned that under the Trump administration, there's a kind of reassertion openly of the Monroe Doctrine, this 200-year-old colonial doctrine. In fact, John Bolton mentioned the Monroe Doctrine recently in discussion of Venezuela, where the U.S. is, of course, launching a right-wing coup attempt, as we've been covering here on our website, The Gray Zone. I'm wondering if you could talk about the situation for Ecuador, because, I've been to Ecuador, and one of the things that struck me is that you use the U.S. dollar. Ecuador has been using the U.S. dollar as its official currency for nearly 2 decades now, which is just a kind of visible sign, a tangible sign of the legacy, the continued legacy of U.S. colonialism and imperialism in Latin America, and what the U.S. refers to as its backyard. And then, in response to that, Correa never really was, as I mentioned, that radical. He wasn't like Hugo Chavez. He wasn't, in the context of the region, he wasn't even really on the left of the pink tide. He was kind of on the center of the pink tide. And, this is someone who studied economics. He studied economics, in fact, at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And, Correa was influenced by kind of Keynesian economists like Joseph Stiglitz, and adopted this idea that, we should use the wealth of Ecuador to benefit our people. We should invest in social programs and health and education. But even that, for Washington, was seen as too radical. So we've seen, as you've been discussing, this massive neoliberal shift, this rightward shift, the massive kind of clampdown on dissent in the country. And it seems that Washington has backed it the entire time. So, there's a lot to respond to there, but maybe can you talk about the legacy that's still ongoing of U.S. colonialism and why someone like Correa, who was really, a kind of social democrat, why even he was seen as too left-wing for the policymakers in Washington?
Yeah, I'm not sure I agree fully with that. I think Correa was very radical in a number of ways. And I would say he was the most structuralist of them all, right? So Correa's big thing was the economy and diversifying from raw materials and education reform and higher education reform, so that you would diversify. And so yeah, from one perspective, you can say, right, this is a typical case of sort of capitalist diversification, moving away from, in many ways, Correa was more about moving towards the welfare state than it was about moving to socialism. So I agree with your argument in that sense. I think, Correa didn't have a militant left-wing background and was cautious economically, which actually I think in many regards was a good thing. I mean, there was, the economy did very well under Correa, and yet there was a lot of redistribution, a lot of reduction of the Gini coefficient, so that measures inequality, a lot of reduction of poverty, and he proved that neoliberalism wasn't just unjust, it was also not the intelligent way forward. So there is a side of him that was sort of intelligent capitalism as opposed to stupid neoliberalism, right? The New Deal as opposed to Reaganomics, if you prefer, yeah? So there was a side of Correa that was about that, yeah. But there was also another side that was really fascinating about a much more in-depth debate about, again, going back to the common good, the public good, the social contract, which wasn't always present in every one of the pink tides governments. There was a major sovereignty agenda. There was a major multilateral agenda. The Correa government was the most aggressive on tax havens. It was the most aggressive on international law and human rights and businesses, and trying to create new bodies of international law and binding treaties and so on and so forth. It was the most aggressive on looking at multilateralism and climate change. Evo as well, but I would say Correa being more technical and Evo more political. So I think you'll find a number of areas where, the questioning of the working of the international system. I was a great admirer of Chavez, but you didn't always see the framing of the issue in the Venezuelan regime like you did see it in the Ecuadorian regime. So in the Ecuadorian government. So I think that he was quite radical, and I think his radicalism was uncomfortable, not just for the United States as a hegemon, but for a number of actors as in global governance. And I think that's quite interesting. So, for example, all the work that he did, I denounced 16 bilateral investment treaties. Correa was one of the most sophisticated voices in denouncing investment state dispute mechanism, what's called ISDS. So all this stuff, which is highly technical, about arbitration courts and how investors always take countries to Washington, to The Hague, to London in arbitration courts and always win and always milk the countries that they win. You raise the minimum wage, you're taken to court because that goes against the bilateral investment treaty that you signed, and you have to pay billions. Correa went to the heart of that at the UN, at the whole diplomacy. Ecuador's diplomacy was mobilized on those kinds of issues, 80% of the time. Assange was just discussed, which was a big thing for the United States. And then there were the sovereignty issues. So getting rid of the biggest military base in Latin America, getting rid of US control over our security and our intelligence and counterintelligence, which was completely US dominated before Correa. The relationship with Uribe, which was a difficult one, not participating in Plan Colombia. There are a number of areas where I think you'll find that, answering your question maybe in a roundabout manner, but some of the powerful actors of this world, including in the United States, and particularly some of the deep state actors, because the US is not a sort of empire with a pyramid where the president controls all. There are all sorts of actors that you deal with when you're a Latin American country, including deep state actors that have a lot of power on what goes on in that country, who are not happy with Correa and who are very happy with Moreno. And I think that's a big part of the story. Yeah.
I think, we've reached the kind of logical terminal end of sort of a soft regime change operation where one of the key prizes for the U.S. has been handed over. I don't know if Julian Assange will be extradited, and Ecuador has accepted the kind of IMF package that's caused so much turbulence. And really, looking back at the 80s and 90s, these kind of austerity packages set the stage for the rise of figures like Correa. So I think we'll see history ultimately repeat itself, and hopefully we're just witnessing a transitional phase. But it's a very dark phase, and it's a right wing. It's a right wing phase across Latin America. Venezuela is under economic embargo. Cuba and Nicaragua are under attack like they haven't been since perhaps the 1980s. And we're entering an election here where we're going to, I think, see an election that will have a major impact on the future of Latin America because the Trump administration is so heavily invested with the Miami lobby and with big oil and the extraction industries. So I think this is a really fascinating discussion all the way from your comments on Assange in the embassy to the whole historical and political context of his abandonment and the giant sellout. Hopefully we'll be able to follow up in the future. And I would also point anyone listening to this to an article on our website by Denis Rogatyuk, and it's called Sellout: How Corruption, Voter Fraud, and a Neoliberal Turn Led Ecuador's Lenin to Give Up Assange, and that provides a real good primer on some of these issues that we just discussed with Guillaume Long, the former foreign minister of Ecuador.
Yeah, and a fun fact, we were just talking about the former leftist president, Rafael Correa. He actually just tweeted out our Gray Zone article, so it's quite cool to see. But Guillaume, thank you so much. That was a very interesting discussion, and thanks for sharing your insight as the former foreign minister of Ecuador. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you, Guillaume.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Max, for having me on the show. See you soon.
And Guillaume is now an associate researcher at the Institute for Strategic and International Relations in Paris, so you can keep track of his work, and I'm sure we'll see much more of him in the future. I'm Ben Norton. I was joined by Max Blumenthal, and for listeners and viewers, you can support this show at Patreon. Just go to patreon.com/moderaterebels to help support our original journalism and interviews like this. That's all. Thanks a lot for listening.
Thanks.